The large title of our conference theme, we have various buzzwords as they were developed by the military press and are used again and again by the military press. And very often they are also discussed at length. The mobile army of metaphors is by Friedrich Nietzsche. In his consideration on truth lies in the extramoral sense. In the introduction, he writes, "What is truth? A movable army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relations which poetically and rhetorically elevated, transmitted, have been adorned, and that after long used by a people actually seem canonical, and truth is an illusion of which we have forgotten that they are illusions. Metaphors that have been used and do not make sense anymore, coins that have lost their image and are now simply metal and no longer coins." We as military media publish our truths in a climate where the political and societal environment, there are many uncertainties that have been dogmatically ordered, nebulous values have been implored, and own moral convictions have been elevated in order to appear unattackable. In this way, social media have erected new piers and stakes where observers may actually get burnt very easily. Freedom of speech is considered high value, but only if it does not leave the mainstream for too much. Otherwise, it's considered warmongering, something that's being sanctioned. Possible crises are actually moderated by the political elite in an incomprehensible manner, and if politicians do something on their own initiative, they are considered illiberal or populistic. Security policy is often associated only with social security guaranteed by the nanny state, whose funding is getting increasingly difficult. The analysis of present states has to remain rather vague for protection. Scientific progress is often limited to the fabrication of new drawers into which current developments are being put. A German journalist, after an argument with politicians, commented Kante statt Kant, edge instead of Kant, Immanuel Kant. From our point of view, we could say, as people who publish, as military journalists, maybe we might want to go for more Machiavelli and less Rousseau. I would now like to get into the topic, and I would like to call on Professor Ringsmose for his statement. He is going to talk to us and give us an insight from his perspective. I
understand German, and I do speak a bit of German, particularly if we're going to speak about the German Bundesliga. I was born and raised 6 kilometers from the German border. So I had 5 German TV channels and 1 Danish. I was 18 when I realized that Bud Spencer is not German. That was a shock to me. So, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm honored and delighted to be here. I'm impressed by the program you put together. I've been given 10 minutes, and as a good Scandinavian Protestant, I will do my utmost to stay within that time limit. Before I go on, I will present to you my 2 main arguments that I'll be making over the next 9.5 minutes. One is that in the West, we should move beyond our traditional binary understanding of war and peace. We are engaged in a political competition. We're not at war, but we are certainly also not having a cooperative peace with particular Russia. My second argument is that so far we have very much been relying on defense and resilience when it comes to all those things in between war and peace. I would argue that we should consider supplementing that approach with an approach of deterrence by punishment. And I will go more into detail in a minute with what I mean by that. I will very much focus on the West and NATO and the West and NATO's relationship with Russia. So that will be the sort of the case. But first, to start out with the binary understanding of war and peace. As I said initially, we're not at war with Russia. We're not at war with any of our opponents, really. And it's highly unlikely, I think, that we will find ourselves at war with Russia, because our deterrence measures are actually working. What NATO put in place in the Baltic states, in Poland, is actually working. We are deterring Russia. The EFP, the NRF, the VJTF, all the reassurance and deterrence measures, they're working. But that does not mean that we are at peace with Russia, at least not in a traditional sense. I think it's not a warm or cooperative peace. To the best of my understanding, we are engaged in a political competition with Russia. And I think that's really important to understand, because that is how it is viewed upon, that's how it is understood in Moscow. With the exception of the military dimension, Russia is actually conducting a lot of malicious activities against us. And we are challenged conceptually, understanding what our relationship to Russia really is. So what I'm going to focus on is all the things in between war and peace. And so it's cyber attacks, it's propaganda, it's disinformation campaigns, subversion, interferences in elections, it's fake news, all the things really that this conference is dealing with. Also, this competition about the political competition dealing with all the things in between war and peace, it's very much about creating certain perceptions of reality, and not least with regard to the informational domain. Our opponent is aiming at making certain audiences in the West or at home subscribe to a distinct perception of reality, because our opponent believe that if they can convince certain audiences to subscribe to certain perceptions of reality, it will further their own interests. So, for example, they will seek to convince Western audiences that NATO is aggressive or useless. They will seek to expand already existing tensions within Western societies. They will interfere in presidential election campaigns or elections, and they will try, as an example, to convince Russian-speaking minorities in Lithuania that German soldiers have raped a local girl. In fact, they tried to do so. And now to my second point. We, the West, so far have been much too passive and relying much too much on resilience and defense when it comes to all the things between war and peace. So I propose that we think about, consider supplementing our resilience strategy, our deterrence by denial strategy, with a more forward-leaning deterrence by punishment strategy or posture. So we're not going to punish Russia with military means if they do fake news or disinformation campaigns. But there are other means that we can employ to make sure that they understand that it will have costs when they do fake news or disinformation campaigns. it's my sense that we in the West have been relying very much on resilience, on recovering, on bouncing back, on setting up defense systems and so on when it comes to subversion, fake news, disinformation campaigns, propaganda and so on. We've been very defensive and very passive in a way. An old NATO hand, Michael Rühle, a German, a year ago, he put it this way: deterring hybrid war will also require other means, such as increased resilience of cyber networks, diversification of energy supplies, and strategic communications that can rapidly correct false information spread by an opponent. Rather than punish an aggressor with military reprisals, deterrence by resilience seeks to dissuade him by demonstrating the futility of his approach. And I think this very much is very much in line with what we have done so far in the West. I think we should move beyond that and supplement with a more forward-leaning approach. So we should try to deter Russia from doing these things. And we should try to deter Russia by punishing them with, we have conventional means, we have diplomatic means, we can asset freeze, we can do more travel restrictions, we can do more economic sanctions. But we could also, and we should also, I believe, enter somewhat into the gray zone ourselves. We should be thinking about retaliating in cyberspace. We have the means. So next time we are targeted with a Russian cyber attack, we should consider, I don't know, closing the lights in Russian barracks, in some Russian barrack for 2 weeks or something like that. Or at least retaliation. We need to retaliate. At the moment, there are no costs associated with these attacks from the Russian side. We should also be much more aggressive in the informational domain. We should be less reactive, more proactive. We should, for instance, we could reveal and make publicly available intelligence that we gathered on Russian corruption, tax evasions amongst the oligarchs, and so on. We have the means to that, and we do even have the information. We should consider supporting Russian media critical of the Kremlin. There are definitely challenges associated with such a posture of deterrence by punishment. First of all, sometimes it's really difficult to attribute who was actually conducting this fake news attack or this cyber attack or this subversion campaign. It's also difficult to come up with targets. We need to be creative. Who are we going to target? Who are we going to retaliate against? Also, we need to be true to our Western values. They do fake news. We cannot do fake news because then we would not, we would be untrue to our values, our own values. We cannot do criminal acts. We cannot covertly interfere in elections in Russia. That would run counter to what we are. But still, I think there are many other things that we can, and I definitely think that we should do.
Ich danke Herrn Ringsmose und darf nun Commander Codner vom altehrwürdigen Rusi Institute seinen Vortrag bitten.
Call on Commander Codner for his talk.
I'm the think tank's perspective on strategic communications, so I apologize that it may be very much a 101 session, but I will be using the United Kingdom as rather a clumsy case study. And I must apologize up front that I'm speaking as an unreliable Anglo-Saxon, currently living through the torments of Brexit, in which a government is providing one of the worst examples ever of strategic communication to its own people. As some of you will remember, the first address I gave to this conference series in 2016 was on the morning after the UK's Brexit referendum, and I'm still in tears. I'll now briefly relate the terminology of strategic communications to strategy, which is the theme of this conference. On the one hand, strategic communications are coordinated, although not necessarily conducted at the strategic levels in military doctrine terms, grand strategic and military strategic. On the other hand, strategic communications should be conducted to contribute to the outcomes of a strategy, whether a grand strategy, security strategy, or a military strategy. I won't have time to relate each of the conference quadriga to strategic communication. Let me just say that there are paradoxes associated with the first three. A consistent and clear narrative is essential to effective strategic communications, but buzzwords are what attract the attention of the media and target audiences. And that's what mediums such as Twitter in particular are all about. No more than 280 characters. That's 28 buzzwords if you include the exclamation marks. And the cyber domain is the new skin for strategic communications, or stratcoms, that's a buzzword itself. On the one hand, it provides a rich means for governments, etc., to communicate elegantly across communities. On the other, the oppositions, the enemies, are likely to be far more agile in this respect than fusty bureaucratic governments. Then there is hybridity. I was sent at short notice recently to Tbilisi, Georgia, of all places, to lead a staff-level course on hybrid warfare, looking at its history, meaning, and the military utility of the concept, if it exists as such. And of course, this is very much old wine, but the new skins are the stratcoms of opponents and the subtle use of media. And when it comes to resilience, I suppose that strategic communications have a lot to do with keeping a government in power, whether democracies, poor Theresa May, quasi-democracies, oligarchies, go for it, Vladimir, or autocracies. But the paradox is, on one side, clarity, consistency, and honesty, and on the other, levers of power, and on the others, they are deception and ambiguity. Indeed, there's a spectrum of conflicting elements of strategic communications. At the one hand, there is public diplomacy, work aiming to improve understanding of a nation to further a government's medium and long-term goals. Then there are information operations, integrated use of electronic warfare, computer network operations, psychological operations, I'll come back to that, military deception and operation security to influence, disrupt, corrupt, or usurp an opponent's human and automated decision-making while protecting one's own. And psychological operations to deceive, confuse, disrupt, and demoralize the enemy to weaken resistance or even get enemy populations to capitulate. And there are two traditional tools. On the one hand, publicity, the straightforward telling of the narrative to build up a picture in the mind of the audience which will win their confidence and support, information which they will want to have. Objective is mutual goodwill, evidence, leaving the judgment to the audience, facts and figures. Then there is propaganda, the deliberate direction or manipulation of information to secure a definite objective, an attempt to control the thinking of the recipient by devious methods with an ulterior motive. Now I'm going to focus specifically on the use of strategic communications by, should I say, right-thinking governments and their militaries. I'll avoid the use Western, because that's a bit Anglo-Saxon. And of course, most important is media relations. On the one hand, there are television, radio, and printed media. On the other hand, there are social media. The first group is relatively straightforward to handle. There may be strong political bias in the individual outlets, but there is some choice in selecting your access, and the journalists are looking to judge honesty as well as to grab the buzzwords for their own headlines. On the other hand, social media, Twitter, the prime example, are not controllable, although they may be seduced, something non-state actors and other entities, including respectable governments, try to exploit. One problem for a government is compromising their influence based on moral standing by lying and using fake news. That's not to say that this will not boost their standing in some communities, as we see from Donald Trump. For governments and militaries, there are the long and short-term effects that need to be considered. I'll now just run through a few bullets of advice from an independent think tank's perspective. I'm sorry this is so brief, but I want to keep to time. Be proactive, not just reactive. Be broad, quick, and pervasive in the use of modern information and the communications environment. There must be a whole government approach, not just defence and the military. And that's a problem, particularly in the United Kingdom, getting that integration. Strategic communications is a part of one of the instruments of power, not merely a tool. In government, it needs high-level ownership, not just setting up a government committee or organisation to carry it forward. It needs leadership from the top. But the military may be in the forefront because of the need to deal with crises and urgent situations. And the targets, they should be one's own population and electorate, foreign audiences that recognise areas of mutual interest, foreign audiences that believe that the country plays a constructive role in international affairs, and foreign audiences that recognise the country as a respectable partner in meeting global challenges, communicate a positive vision, and engage on positive terms where possible, but countering violent extremism by discrediting, denigrating, and delegitimizing violent extremist ideology. It needs to be a two-way process, obtaining feedback from audiences and making use of social media in that way and other opportunities. There needs to be consistency in the face of competing messages and alternative voices. And there needs to be an agile response to subtle shifts in policy and the strategic environment. Communications should be used to inform and shape national strategy, so strategy can evolve. That's an important contribution, I think. But we have, as we have discussed a lot in this conference, the nation must have a grand strategy for its continuation and security with a supporting military strategy. In UK, there is very much a lack of strategy, which I can discuss in questions. Some relevant buzzwords in the UK are global influence, lack of vision, the pragmatic approach, and muddling through. And strategic communications must not be brought in too late. What is fundamentally important for governments is competence and credibility. The medium that is used to reflect the target audience, whether it is social media, microblogging, TV, radio, rhetoric, hard copy, website coverage, or personal emails. But watch out for the general data processing regulations. Relate the communications to actions. Go somewhere symbolic or significant if you are a politician. Relate and then make announcements, perhaps in some event or show. Make use of presence operations by your armed forces. And this may be taken forward a key stage further, of course, if there is a need for directed deterrence or containment or indeed compellence. Governments should consider cognitive manoeuvring. They may want to try and shape the criteria against how they are judged. For instance, associate it with responsibility to protect national interest, rule of law and international norms, and social and cultural norms of the nation. It's important that governments are, as I say again, coherent and consistent. They need to communicate a wise strategy with a clear objective, not just options. But if government information appears to the audience to be too closely managed, the impression can be of government spin, and this is not helpful to a government to speak with one voice to different audiences. Immediate and short-term goals need to be presented as consistent with medium and long-term effects. This is all about strategy. And one challenge, particularly in the military context, is the coherent relationship between a short-term strategy for a particular engagement or operation and the long-term strategy, the vision of the nation. There may be some variance, and strategies have to evolve. In many circumstances, it may be necessary to depoliticize and demilitarize the debate and discussion. There is the option of using other advocates and stakeholders, such as teachers, doctors, civil engineers, and of course, NGOs, non-governmental organizations. So government should try to build up useful relationships, particularly important in countering radicalization. It's not the government message that will help, but that of community and religious leaders, teachers, families, and youth workers. And as a think tank, I would also recommend track 2 options, where think tanks are encouraged and perhaps funded to hold seminars and workshops with representatives of government, academics, and other stakeholders. The challenges for governments and militaries, and also for NATO and the European Union, are first navigating the complexity of national interests, different cultures and languages, interpreting and articulating policy concerns to varied domestic and international audiences, responding and adapting to facts on the ground and to the response of target audiences and adversaries, gathering intelligence and making use of researchers and analysts with expert local knowledge as well as intelligence agencies, exploring the human terrain, countering enemy propaganda, misinformation and opposing information, and different messages to different audiences must be consistent with each other. Of course, the United Kingdom at present is pretty useless in managing strategic communications in the shambles of Brexit, with all the divisions inside the political parties and inside government. Then there's all the uncertainty of the future of the so-called special relationship with the United States in the Trump era, or should I say epoch, or perhaps moment. But there was one remarkable success story, in the short term at least, that was the outcome of the Salisbury poisonings, the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal and his daughter with the military poison Novichok. This could be characterized as hybrid warfare. The United Kingdom's government stated that this was clearly a Russian initiative with at least top government permission. There was a pretty clear UK government narrative that was not boring. The response in social media, clearly with Russian initiation, and in some controlled press media, was probably deliberately designed to increase ambiguity because the stories were very diverse and inconsistent. But the response by so many governments, several who were not obvious close friends or allies of the United Kingdom, in expelling Russian diplomats, was quite astonishing. So my concluding buzzwords for governments are a strong narrative, simplicity, consistency, research, coherence and coordination, indivisibility, dialogue, and assessment, tracking media outputs and using polling and focus groups. Thank you.
Danke. Am Schluss komprimiert, zusammengefasst.
This was very dense and nicely summed up. Great if you have a national interest. I would like to call on our next speaker, Mr. Jeschonek.
Thank you very much. In my short presentation, I would like to talk about the connections and the interrelations between strategic communication, strategic development at the national level and its implementation, while taking into account this quadriga of terms, as well as the question discussed in the framework of this conference. Now let me come back to strategic communication. As we've already heard, strategic communication is about collecting, processing, and documenting selected, specially prepared, processed, and interest-guided information or data in order to achieve a target of preeminent importance. There are groups of individuals or the entire population of a state or a community are the target groups. Of course, our own side, if we're talking about strategy, and also the other side. Now, strategic communication is first and foremost shaped by one side, that is to say, by those who develop and design the strategy. But it can also be shaped by third parties that are in charge of communication, and we have discovered this as a new treasure chest and like a gold mine for themselves. And thirdly, strategic communication can also be seen as something that is done by the other side, by the opponent or enemy. Now, communication is basing itself on the entire spectrum of the media: print, audiovisual media, social media, and also different forms of dialogue and different societal groups. This is significant because this form of strategic communication is now relatively new when compared to the communication that we had for several centuries, where we had messengers on horseback who would announce the message passed down by the emperor. And they weren't really competing if they had to sell their messages in a marketplace. Now, this takes us to our challenges. Challenges for those who are supporting the strategic advisors, no matter in which way. First and foremost, strategic communication means that we need to disseminate important information, and this helps to implement strategy and to enforce strategies. Also the pan-national strategy. As the previous speaker already said, it's important to differentiate between long-term strategy development and the continuation of an evolutionary strategy, or amendments of strategy, or a sudden implementation of strategies that you had in a drawer. For example, in case of an act of terrorism, a state normally has strategies in a drawer, but these are not really part of the current continuous overall strategy. Now, as far as the ethical claims are concerned, strategic communication should be true, verifiable, and understandable. So the postulate is, and my previous speakers have actually illustrated repeatedly, that in reality strategic communication is being abused, and it actually is turned into a weapon. Now, the means to implement strategies cannot only be done by providing information as such, but strategic communication can be used to conceal, mask, and deceive. Strategic communication, if it is deceptive in nature, can actually mean that strategies that are supposed to remain secret because of a given conflict or argument for which they were developed, so can be kept a secret. And strategic communication can actually fill a vacuum. And this takes us to the negative aspect that the previous speaker referred to, namely that strategic communication, as far as a sober and neutral wording is concerned, can be defined as being white information or gray information, which is also accompanying, but which also contains selective information that can manipulate and produce a certain effect that goes beyond simple explanation, or black information, which is wrong and is used for manipulation or as a weapon and is focused on completely different target groups. And the objective is to undermine resilience. So strategic communication is an important tool for pan-national actors if they are to develop and implement strategies. And this is why there are special rules and principles that we need to comment on. Now, if these strategies are to be effective, they need to be implemented in synchronicity. The strategy needs to be formed, decisions need to be taken about the strategy, and then it needs to be implemented to make sure that opponents could not come up with counter-narratives and countermeasures in order to thwart and paralyze your strategy. So this might have, of course, a negative impact on the one who is supposed to define and implement a strategy. Now, I would like to make a few comments with respect to this quadriga of the four concepts that we are discussing here. And at first we have the narrative. Strategic communication and narratives are in a very close relationship, because strategic communication uses narrative. It uses narrative on the one hand in order to make sure that the strategy is explained to the target group. That's a positive sense. But a negative narrative is used in order to make sure that a certain strategy and certain goals are reached in order to weaken your opponent. And this is why narratives can be used not only in the form of facts and figures, but also manipulated facts can be used. Now, the second concept is also of interest in this quadriga when it comes to strategic communication, because the information space forms a channel. It's a channel that is used to convey the information. As has been mentioned repeatedly, if the stream of flow in the channel is stopped, manipulated, or falsified, then maybe the strategic communication cannot find its target group or cannot be received by them. So this forces you to get out of cyberspace and maybe use different, more complicated and not so effective ways in order to, well, strategically communicate with your target group. And in the worst case, this can be done with a megaphone or with flyers, different forms of communication that can circumvent or get around cyberspace. On the other hand, it is also important to make sure that cyberspace is protected and kept free and unencumbered with methods and means that already exist today, but that need to be developed further and enhanced in order to make sure that we keep our dominant position. Hybridity, this is a concept that has been repeatedly referred to in various presentations. It is directly linked with strategic communication, also because of the fact that strategic communication is part of a hybrid conflict, and they have an impact on this conflict. Now, why does hybridity play a special role here? The reason it plays a role is that humanitarian international law and the development of international humanitarian law, an offensive war, or war used as a means in order to obtain your interests, well, is banished. So the strategist who is pursuing certain interests, like, for example, wanting to increase his power for whatever reason, so the strategist will try to find ways and means that are offered by hybridity, by hybrid forms of warfare. And in preparing for this approach, for this hybrid approach, strategic communication is an ideal tool that is not illegal, that cannot be punished, and you can use this before the next stage follows with the little green men, or where you close the channels of communication, and that can already be seen as a hostile act. So this is why strategic communication plays an important role in the initial stage and also in the follow-up stage when there's a hybrid form of warfare. So you can reach strategic targets without any major battles. Now let's talk about resilience. We've already heard a lot about resilience, so it is enough to summarize this by saying that strategic communication is one essential means in order to generate resilience or to maintain it. It is a protective shield once resilience is demolished. So let me summarize. If we talk about strategy in the largest sense of the term, we need to talk about strategic communication. I wanted to make it clear how strategic communication can help the strategist, but we also need to bear in mind that strategic communication is also used by the opposite side in order to help them reach their target with the minimum use of violence, but with a very high level of effectiveness. Thank you for being so short and concise. Yes, I'd like to stand up so that you can get a different perspective and look in a different direction, because I have the unpleasant task, in light of these brilliant presentations, I have the task of bringing you back down to earth. So that's the Inspector General. That's not me. Well, that's the only picture that we have here, unfortunately. Well, that's really a great joke. You see the former Inspector General of the Bundeswehr, the German Armed Forces. But the picture that I sent you, that was actually me. So, okay, well, that shouldn't be published, otherwise I will get a big problem. Well, that's hybrid warfare, you might say, right? Okay. Well, to make matters short, that was a good one. I would like to introduce the Society for Security Policy. That's a society that was created in 1952 in Germany. Last week I was in Berlin, not to visit the General Inspector, and I went to the Brandenburg Gate with the quadriga and the goddess Irene. So here at this conference, Rethinking Strategy, the organizer takes over a quadriga of artificial terms, so narrative, cyber, hybridity, and resilience. No need to go into detail here. So the question whether these sociological terms are actually new phenomena or old wine in new skins, or whether it's just a mobile army of metaphors, well, we talked about this at length, so there's no need to talk about it. So let's get off this battle card of the quadriga and let's communicate with the public. Even before the Federal Republic of Germany was founded in 1949, efforts were made to create a civilian, independent and non-partisan association for security policy. It was focused on the defensive resilience of the Federal Republic of Germany, and it also opposed the disadvantage of former Wehrmacht soldiers in post-war society. Now, with the decision for rearmament and the accession of the Federal Republic of Germany to the North Atlantic Alliance, NATO, the integration into the Western community of values had been fulfilled. So today, when we are talking about strategic communication, we need to look at what happened after 1952, and that was the foundation of this Society for Military Science, as it was called back then. So let's take a look at the Statutes of 1952. In the Statutes, it is said in Article 1, and I quote, "The purpose of the association is, in view of the Cold War, to strengthen the will to defend the country, to promote the readiness to defend the Federal Republic of Germany, and to contribute to the clarification of defense problems." All this is not aimed at specific areas and groups, but it is intended to encompass all circles of the German population. Now, in order to come up with a stable foundation for this Society on Military Science, in 1953 the Society made an agreement with the press agency of the government. And since that time, the public authorities provide the funding. So I'll leave some of my presentation out and skip over that. So as far as topics of security and defense policy are concerned, the offers in Germany are quite modest. So from the three political fields that I referred to, what's most missing is the security policy. So that means that there are tools of strategic communication that exist, but the use of strategic communication, so the objectives are quite modest when compared to the requirements. So if we want to develop a certain resilience or ability to resist in the society, we need accompanying work. But often our society failed due to the pacifism that is contained within our society and the fabric of our society. A strategic community was only formed in very modest terms in Germany. A special susceptibility for hybrid softening can therefore not be excluded. And in future, it cannot be excluded whether synchronous communication will be able to reach the population. So it would be desirable to strengthen resilience in the world that has come, that is no longer in order. This would be really desirable. So when compulsory military service was introduced, and since July of 2011 it has been suspended, the Bundeswehr was used to educate generations of young men in the area of security and defense policy, but all of that has now been eliminated. Now let's take another look back to 1969. So in June of 1969, in the German military publishing house of the East German Republic, there was a publication as to the role for the militarization of Western Germany. But unfortunately, I can't really go into detail here, but I would like to just quote one sentence. Among the institutions that have developed a lively political, ideological, military, theoretical, and organizational activity in support of remilitarization and nuclear armament, the Society for Military Science has occupied an important place for many years. Seen the other way around, one can certainly attest that our society is resilient with respect to propaganda attempts coming from the East. After the fall of the Iron Curtain or the war in 1989 and the German reunification, the foreign and security policy situation changed. I don't need to dwell on that. But of course what changed were also the topics that our society tried to convey to the public. And in the year of reunification in 1990, the Federal Assembly decided to change the name of the society. So Wehrkunde, this word, military science, well, that was something that was taught in former East Germany. So it was called the Society for Defense and Security Policy. So let me now jump forward to 2010. We now have a female president, so we didn't have that since 1952. So we also decided to change our statutes. We celebrated our 60-year anniversary in a large ceremony in Berlin. He wasn't the general inspector, but the Federal Minister of Defense, Thomas de Maizière, was the keynote speaker. In order to be more present in Berlin, because our offices are still in Bonn, the first Berlin Security Dialogue was organized in 2016 in the Federal Press Office. So the topic was, of course, after 2015, was the causes of migration around Europe. So what are our chances of influencing matters? The next dialogue dealt with Russia, understanding Russia Is that possible? Question mark. Security policy course setting in difficult times. And this year in October, there will be the next dialogue. And you can imagine what it is, thinking about President Trump and Kim Jong-un. So it will be proliferation that will be on the agenda in October of this year. Now, there's another major event that is organized for the 14th time, is the Petersburg Talks. Petersburg near Bonn. It is well known for many major events, and the Petersburg venue attracts a lot of people. So let me briefly talk about the change. So our society certainly combines more than just the protection of its own national borders by armed forces. There's internal security, terrorism, environmental protection, civil protection, economic protection, and migration. Social, religious, demographic, and ecological aspects are assigned to this extended concept of security. The ongoing crisis, conflicts, and civil wars in Europe and beyond show the urgent need for security policy information and educational work. Objective information free of ideology on helping people to form their own opinion and strengthening the resilience of our society have increased in importance, as we've heard repeatedly. So we also need to show the connections and backgrounds of networked security precautions for the preservation of our freely democratic basic order. We have lots of volunteers. We have about 6,000 members in our society, and of course they pay contributions, and there's government grants, donations, and we also have support for individual projects. So we have about 90 sections across Germany, from north to south, east to west. We have 6 regional groups, and then we have Berlin and Bonn that are independent sections, and last year we had more than 4,000 events that were organized with more than 100,000 participants. Right, now let me summarize, and I hope that I stuck to the time limit allotted to me. The Society for Security Policy does voluntary public relations work in the field of security and defense policy, and it thus provides strategic communication within the framework of security policy strategy development. It pleads for a general willingness to defend, with particular attention to the German armed forces, and it supports the overall state responsibility for resilience. Germany's integration into the European Union, the deepening of the transatlantic partnership, and the peace missions of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the United Nations are supported. Our society, the GSP, promotes the understanding and thus strengthens the population's resilience for political, economic, ecological, and cultural contexts in connection with the resulting global security policy aspects. And ultimately, the responsible voluntary commitment of the members of our society since 1952 has served peace and the freedom of all citizens of the Federal Republic of Germany. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Dass es Fragen geben sollte.
So if there are any questions for the speakers.
Bitte.
I'm from the Technical University of Darmstadt. I have a general question for you. How do you assess the priorities and the importance of strategic communication between countries and to maintain this communication, or maybe to interrupt it? When do you interrupt a strategic communication with another country? Are there strategies and counter-strategies? I think this also plays a role in communication. And do you believe that there's a generational difference in terms of strategic communication, and does this play a role? So older and younger people. So is there a disconnect? I don't know whether one of the gentlemen wants to answer that, but I myself have the problem that when I talk about strategic communication, well, this is a communication science term, and here when we talk about communication, it's communication about strategy. Basically, strategic communication is a long-term exercise in order to convey a message and to form a brand image, and that of course needs to trickle down. And then we are talking about this communication about strategic matters, or how do you communicate your strategy to the outside world, or how do you communicate with the outside world in terms of your attitude. So I think we would need to agree what kind of strategic communication we are talking about. Communicating about strategy or strategic communication. Well, the question was, are there any diplomatic measures in the dealings between nations that are not necessarily in a conflict, but that could be in a conflict? So, compliments, it's a highly, tricky question, because if a president communicates via Twitter, actually the governmental instruments are no longer used, but he engages upon the path of strategic communication, which generically is actually used as a peaceful tool of communication. Now, governments between them, of course, also have strategic communication, but that is actually summarized under the term of diplomacy. And I think your minister made this very clear. But I can say that through technology, the media, and the use of media by the strategists, and with the example of Trump, this is shown quite clearly, well, they are engaged in communication. And our friend Putin, for example, uses this because on a monthly basis, or at least regularly, he steps in front of TV cameras in front of a selective audience of the Russian society, and he was interviewed there, and this is broadcast, and this is also a form of strategic communication. So, to give you an answer, strategic communication is very broad-based, very diverse, because there are many different means, channels, and forms. And that's part of the game. I'll be brief. On your badge, you see the EMPA logo. So that's the European Military Press Association, right? So since 1979, the Italians have tried to organize a meeting in Rome and to get military journalists. I'm not talking about military or strategic communication. So let's just talk about communication without the strategic. So they tried to bring people together and think about our united Europe, to exchange magazines, to create links with editors-in-chief and so on. So that was an approach that had been going on since '79, and this still exists today, but basically, and unfortunately I have to admit, it never made it all the way to the ministries. So the ministries never supported this. And you can tell by looking at our agenda, we also have the EMPA logo here, and General Peichel, in his modesty, didn't say that he's also the president of the European Military Press Association, the EMPA. So when I was still active in my career as an editor-in-chief, I also tried to establish those links. We managed to do it with the French, surprisingly. The French are normally very independent. And with the British, we never managed to do it, and that's probably why they are now leaving Europe. If we had done it back then, if you had hooked up with the British, maybe they wouldn't have left. The Italians, well, that was good too. And there were good ties between Austria and Switzerland, so those were the best ties. So most of our members are either from Austria or Switzerland. So much by way of an answer for communication. At least let's leave the strategic part of communication aside. Mr. Ringrose.
Right. It's about strategic communication and actors. And basically, at the end of the day, I think there's no inherent connection between strategic communication and certain actors. You can do strategic communication towards anyone. When I left Copenhagen, I did strategic communication towards my children, telling them that they would, my mother-in-law would be there looking after them. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Okay, go away. That would be great. I was furthering my own interest by using strategic communication. But I think at the end of the day, I think it's important to keep in mind what this is about. To me, very often it's about sense-making. There's a lot of research pointing in the direction of that we as human beings make sense of reality through narratives. We understand the world around us through stories. There's a beginning, there's an end, there's a plot, and so on. So if you do strategic communication or do strategic narratives, you're thinking strategically about what kind of sense-making, what kind of story you want people to believe. So in a way, strategic communication and strategic narratives is all about sense-making, trying to offer an audience a distinct portrayal of reality that makes sense to them. And you can do that towards your children, you can do that towards the German or the Italians or even the Brits, and that is strategic communication.
Dankeschön. Ich würde vorschlagen.
Thank you. I suggest if there are any further questions, go ahead, please. Thank you. Johann Schmidt, BMWG, Berlin. Two minor questions for Mr. Ringrose. I found the model war, peace, and political competition that was very enlightening. So, how would you rate the relations with our closest allies, where we're also seeing some elements that would normally be ascribed to hybrid opponents, so economic measures or mutual espionage or whatever? The second question, you're talking about the fact that the deterrent measures are working as far as Russia was concerned, and you gave some examples of this, but at the same time you're asking for a change of the strategic approach in terms of more punishment. Why? The EU measures, for example, are working. Our sanctions are the sharpest sword of the European Union. On the other hand, you're also asking us to penetrate into the gray zones. That can also be unappetizing at times. But at the same time, you're also asking us to stick to our Western values. So how can you, well, bridge this gap?
Questions, and if I understood you correctly, it was actually 3 questions. But let me try to elaborate a bit on what I mean when I talk about cooperation, competition, and war. Basically, I think we should conceptualize or think conceptually of what our relationship, for instance, with Russia. On the one side hand, you can have cooperation, that is warm peace. And the other side, you can have competition. But there are different dimensions between competition and cooperation. There's a military competition. If we have military competition, high scale, that is war. Then there's a dimension about the informational dimension. There's a diplomatic dimension. There is an economic dimension. And the interesting thing is that you can actually have competition on one dimension at the same time as you will have competition or cooperation on other dimensions. So for instance, let's take a look at Norway. Norway certainly have a diplomatic competition or political competition with Russia at the moment. But at the same time, they have a very good cooperation in the high north on fishery and so on. So I think it provides us with a model for, in a more nuanced way, reflecting on the differences between war, peace, competition, cooperation, and so on. Deterrence by punishment. What I think about is that in the literature, you make the distinction between deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment. When we try to deter an opponent by denial, we will set up an effective defense, make it very, very costly to him to invade us, for instance. If we deter by punishment, we deter by retaliation. We're not setting up a huge defensive structure, but we make sure that he's convinced that we will retaliate, big time. And that is what we're doing right now in the Baltic countries and in Poland. We are not setting up a defense. The EFP battalion, with all respect, they have no chance. That's not a defense against a Russian aggression. That is a tripwire, and it's there to trick, basically, an American response, an American retaliation. That is what the EFP and the American, Europeans' defense and reassurance initiatives. But when I talk about deterrence by punishment in the sphere in between war and peace, I'm not talking about classic deterrence by retaliation. I'm not suggesting that we should attack Russia militarily if they do a cyber attack on us. I'm not suggesting that we should nuke the high north or the Kola Peninsula if they do fake news. That would be nonsense, and it would not be credible. What I'm suggesting is that we engage in another kind of deterrence by punishment, one that is more actually akin to the way you bring up your children. So when my kid steals the cookies, I will punish them just a little bit. I'll not go nuclear on them, but I'll take away their iPad for a week. And if they do it again, I will take their iPad once again. And again, at some point, they will stop stealing the cookies, right? At the moment, what we're doing towards Russia in this sphere is we're trying to do deterrence by denial and resilience. So what, if you use the analogy of bringing up children, each time they steal cookies, we threaten by making more cookies. That is what we're doing. So we recover, we bounce back. We don't put any costs on Russia. So seen from Kremlin, it is cost-free to do another fake news attack. It's cost-free to do disinformation campaigns or even cyber campaigns. My own country was attacked by cyber means a few months ago, and we lost a particular company lost close to 4 billion kroners. I can't do the math in euros right now, but that's a lot. What we did was our Minister of Defense said, "Oh, bad Russia. We knew it was you." And that was it. So why should the Kremlin not once again steal the cookies if we don't deter by punishment?
Danke. Wenn sonst keine Fragen.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, I think we're making good time. And I think we have caught up these 35 minutes by making 34 minutes delay. So I think we deserve a short break for this victory, and then we can summarize the panel results also from the other panels. Thank you.